Not really sure where everybody is, but it is 7:41 now, so I'm going to get started talking here. I do finally have a PowerPoint for you that I have uploaded to the files section of, although it seems that the files section is not visible to you. Let me see if I can fix that real quickly. Sections, navigation, files, save. Okay, so if you go to Canvas and you should see a Files tab there. And within that Files tab, there is a folder called Lecture PowerPoints, and I have put the Russian Revolution PowerPoint that we are going to go through starting today. Now, of course, we've been lecturing about this, so some of the things in the PowerPoint are probably going to be a bit of review from things that we talked about last week, but that's not a big problem. We can just cover this as we usually would. So, without further ado, let me open this PowerPoint up. And we're going to start on slide 6. Pop this over here. I have to do some window adjustment. There should be a Files tab there, Zoe. Maybe refresh your page or something, but I can see it there now. Okay, so let's start on slide 6, talking about oppressive rulers in Russia. And we talked about Nicholas II, who is the last Tsar of Russia, and he is considered an authoritarian, autocratic ruler. And Russia really had a long tradition of rulers like this, including Nicholas I, going back in the 1800s. Nicholas I, Alexander the Third, I think it was also pretty oppressive. And so Nicholas II was yet another Tsar in a long line of Tsars who had been really oppressive. And they had utilized, for example, these pogroms, P-O-G-R-A-M-S, pogroms, not programs, but pogroms. Or I guess it's P-O... Maybe it's O-M-S. I think it's pogroms like that. But pogroms are basically organized violence, particularly against Jewish folks. They used strict censorship. There's no, the Enlightenment that we learned about first semester, where we learned about freedom of speech and life, liberty, and property, and all of those ideas, they don't really spread to Russia during that time. Russia remains, industrially behind. They remain politically kind of old school and conservative. And so, there's strict censorship. The Tsar has absolute authority. Only the Russian language was to be spoken, except for the nobility, who also spoke French. They were only allowed, there's no freedom of worship. You had to worship the Russian Orthodox Church. And they, of course, used a secret police force, and the Russians became very well known for that. I mentioned to you a minute ago the critics, or rather I mentioned Tsar Alexander III. There was also a Tsar Alexander II late in his reign who became very increasingly conservative and autocratic. You had people as early as the late 1800s, that like Mikhail Bakunin was his name. He was an anarchist. He believed the state should be destroyed. You also have increasingly more numbers of people who are subscribing to this intellectual movement known as nihilism, who believed in nothing but science and that the social order should be completely wiped out and built up from scratch. So you've got these political movements in the 1800s, and ultimately Tsar Alexander II, the guy that came 2 Tsars before Nicholas II, was assassinated in 1881 by radicals who bombed his horse carriage in St. Petersburg, just outside a church. I think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. No, that's the one in... I can never remember the name of this church. But anyhow, there's a church in St. Petersburg, and there was a Tsar who was assassinated, and his carriage was bombed just outside this church, and you can still go to the very location where he was assassinated in St. Petersburg. And so this autocratic authoritarian rule had been a practice. The point of this is to tell you that this had been a practice going long before Nicholas II. Nicholas II just continues some of these long-standing practices like the use of censorship, secret police, other things like that. Russia starts to industrialize in the late 1800s by building railroads, in particular using German investments. So a number of German industrial investors began dumping money into Russia to help them build railroads. And they start to rapidly industrialize, which changed the economy and kind of Russian society really quickly. So factories doubled between 1863 and 1900 at the start of Nicholas II's rule. They ended up becoming the 4th leading steel producer due to higher taxes on citizens and foreign investment. And they were building that Trans-Siberian Railway, which I told you about last week, was the thing that led Russia over to the east over here, which resulted in them getting wrapped up in that conflict over Korea with Japan, the Russo-Japanese War that Russia ended up losing. And so that was really this railroad that they built across the country in order to establish this warm water port over here in Vladivostok is exactly what directly leads to the Russo-Japanese War. Russia was put on the gold standard as well to strengthen their government's finances. And by 1900, as I said, Russia was 4th in steel production behind the U.S., Germany, and Britain. And by 1900, Russia was exporting half the world's refined petroleum, or what would be used for things like gasoline and things like that. Railroads enabled Russia to export grain and earn profits for further industrialization. And this helped to start stimulating domestic manufacturing. In other words, manufacturing at home in Russia. So we start to see industrial suburbs pop up around Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are the 2 largest urban areas in Russia. And we start to see a new class of modern factory workers start to emerge there. Now, of course, remember, in Britain, in America, even in places like Belgium and Germany, the class of factory workers had been around for about a century. But in Russia, they only start developing like this factory working class population around the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s. And that happens to coincide right along with both World War I and the Russian Revolution, which is the title, of course, of our unit. Here's, finally, I can show you what Nicholas II looked like. This is a painting of Nicholas II. And he is the last Tsar who comes to power in 1894. And as I told you last week, Nicholas II was devoted to keeping total control over Russia. He was really very autocratic. He's very much a control freak over things. He's unwilling to delegate work out to other people. And he has this rather uncharismatic personality. He's quiet. He's rather introverted. He doesn't like large crowds. And he lives the life of kind of a private, wealthy monarch, kind of a Wizard of Oz sort of figure. He's a guy who rules with absolute authority, but kind of behind closed curtains. All right. Politically, the Tsar's usual nickname, the people's little father, Nicholas doesn't really act the part. And this says he left most of his state affairs to his ministers. There are other ways, though, in which Nicholas II is unwilling to give up authority to other folks. And when I say it's really only when Rasputin comes around that he starts to leave affairs to his ministers as he goes out and is preoccupied with the war. But early in his reign, he's kind of a control freak. A British cartoon illustrates Russia's declining prestige as the sands of the hourglass in this are running out. And Russia's Pacific Fleet, remember, in 1904, 1905, which is when this primary resource comes from, January 4th, 1905, is right at the end of the Russo-Japanese conflict that Russia found themselves on the losing end of, and an even greater naval disaster occurred just months later. And so, other nations around Europe were aware of Russia's kind of declining state power at this time, seemingly unable to pull themselves together and keep control over the nation. And a woodcut print here shows the Russian Tsar waking up from a nightmare where Russian forces are returning from battle. And the date from this, once again, is 1904, 1905. As you can see, this is a bit of Russian or Japanese propaganda demonstrating the might of Japanese industrialization, startling the Tsar out of his sleep. And so this is kind of a unique source because it comes from Japan. So talking a little bit more about Nicholas II, Nicholas II is in many ways a very typical autocratic absolute monarch, okay? Absolute king, right? A guy whose power is completely centralized. But remember that absolutism as a political style had been around for a really long time. And Nicholas II was one of a long line of 300 years worth of people from the Romanov dynasty, which was his family dynasty, who had been in charge of Russia going all the way back to the 1500s. And so Nicholas II is pretty typical in the sense that he's going to be extremely religious, very, very strong Eastern Russian Orthodox faith, which is different than Catholicism. The further east you go in Europe, the more likely people are to subscribe to Eastern Orthodox sects of Christianity. And he has a large family. I mentioned to you his wife, Alexandra, last week. We talked about her and her alleged affair with Rasputin, Grigory Rasputin. His son, Alexei, his sole, son, his only son, and the heir to the throne, who was weak and sickly and had hemophilia. And then the famous, quote-unquote, missing daughter, Anastasia, was another famous story of Nicholas II. Maybe you've ever seen the old animated movie Anastasia, where Anastasia escapes and whatever. Unfortunately, in real life, Anastasia, just like the rest of Nicholas II's 5 children, does not escape Russia. The entire family is executed, basically by way of being shot point blank. And And so, unfortunately, the story of Anastasia is one that is wrapped up in a lot of fiction. It's not an accurate historical tale. She does not make it out alive. But there are a number of other conditions going on in Russia that ultimately lead to revolution there. Rapid industrialization had stirred up discontent. If I remind you, remember when we were talking about the Industrial Revolution unit in first semester, I told you about how when a nation first starts to industrialize, typically in the early years of industrialization, we actually see a significant drop in the quality of life, because with industrialization comes along with it social changes that people don't really like. Harsh living conditions, overpopulation in urban areas, disease, pollution, dangerous situations, both living situations outside of work and then dangerous situations at work. Because in the early years of industrialization, because industrialization brings with it all of these changes in how the economy works, that naturally has a bunch of effects, unforeseen effects in the early days of industrialization that people don't like. Working long hours in factories where they're dimly lit, they're dangerous. Crime goes up in the cities because it's overpopulated. Quality of life expectancy drops usually in the first 20 years of industrialization. And then it's only after the government starts to realize, like, oh, you know, industrialization has resulted in the misery of an entire group of people who hate, you know, having to wake up and go and work in factories and live in crowded, crappy conditions and stuff like that. And so the government will start passing reforms to, for example, like we talked about, limit the workday, give people breaks. Labor unions usually start to develop, and people's wages start to improve. That's if the government is willing to make change. But as we've been talking about with Russia, remember that Tsar Nicholas II had opportunity after opportunity to agree to initiating reforms in Russia that could have, turned down the temperature and prevented this situation from kind of boiling over. I don't know if you've ever made, like, for example, noodles, and you put the cover on the noodles and then they start boiling over onto your stovetop. Well, if you just take the cover off the pot, it allows that air to escape, things simmer down, and you don't have to deal with a giant mess afterwards. In Russia, essentially, Nicholas II absolutely refuses to take the lid off the, pot of boiling water that's about to boil right over and cause a whole lot of problems. And he just stalwartly opposes any changes. And so what happens? People get angrier. People become upset. And so bad working conditions, low wages, child labor, which, remember, we talked about, they got rid of child labor in places like Britain and America. And the fact that labor unions were outlawed in Russia ultimately, and what is a labor union? In case you don't know what a labor union is, that's when the workers in a place, let's say they're plumbers or electricians, labor unions are usually divided by the kind of work that these laborers perform. But different various labor unions are able to bargain for better working conditions, better pay, things like that, because the workers bind themselves together in a large group called a union. And the union, when they act together, is able to collectively put pressure on like factory owners and the government and stuff like that. And so the fact that there were no labor unions led to workers going on strike. That's when workers refused to work. And the hope is when they refuse to work that they will put enough pressure on to initiate changes that they want to see made. And so, like, if a labor, say, for example, and we see strikes happen even to this day here in the United States. So, like, for example, sometimes teacher unions will go on strike, or grocery worker unions will go on strike for better working conditions and stuff like that. And so, and this can cause this when people stop working, obviously it causes headaches, right? People get, it's annoying because it's like, I just want to go to the grocery store and buy some eggs and whatever. And the grocery workers are on strike, and it's like, oh, geez, I have to like walk through the picket lines and they're going to be booing me and stuff. It puts pressure on. And so strikes can be very effective in trying to initiate change. But once again, these strikes, they don't turn out well. Sometimes the Russian military has to subdue these strikes and other things like that. And ultimately, this creates conditions that lead to a point where it's going to be worse in terms of revolution. Now, again, reviewing some topics we talked about last week. Marxism, we talked about Karl Marx. This is him here. Remember that he is not Russian, he is German. Okay, Karl Marx is a German political philosopher from the mid-1800s, but he's the guy who wrote that book, The Communist Manifesto. And in the Communist Manifesto, he made a prediction that due to industrialization, the new oppressed class of workers who worked in factories and whose lives became very miserable in the early years of industrialization would ultimately realize how miserable their conditions were, stop allowing for the ruling class to exploit them and keep them oppressed, and rise up and overthrow the entire government. That was kind of Marx's prediction. He thought that the working class, what he called the proletariat, which we learned that word last week, the proletariat would ultimately rise up, overthrow the government, and create a classless society. Okay? And so this idea of communism, sometimes nicknamed Marxism because they name it after Marx, was a very radical form of socialism where all aspects of industry, of the economy, are owned and operated by the government. And we talked about that last week. And the ideas of Karl Marx are really, taken in or embraced by Vladimir Lenin, that Russian political revolutionary of the late early 1900s. So Marx believed that the proletariat, could overthrow a ruler in Russia, that would be the Tsar, and that the working class would ultimately create a completely equal society. So the difference, again, talking about socialism and communism, these words are often used interchangeably, but they're not the same word. If they were, we wouldn't have two words for it. Socialism is where everyone owns and shares and is equal voluntarily. That is to say that in a democratic nation, people will vote for certain aspects of society to be owned and operated by the government for the public good. For example, we all appreciate that we have national parks systems to keep, some of the more beautiful territories of the United States, or even the state park system here in California. We want to keep those lands protected so that other private companies don't go there and buy them up and start, trashing the countryside. We all like that. We all appreciate the Postal Service. We all like having police and fire service when we need them. We like having public schools. All of these are paid for, but we all volunteer to pay for those things through our tax dollars via voting. And if people wanted to get rid of those aspects, they could hold a vote and get rid of them. But But that's the difference between socialism and communism, because communism, the government owns everything and decides what is equal. So there is no freedom within the population. Communism is totalitarian. They control the entire the state controls the entire economy. They control what people can and can't say. They control what's produced. They control how much it costs. They control how much people get paid. Okay, and there's very, 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 very little freedom. And that's because in order to create an equal society, that essentially means that you have to rob people's freedom from them. All right. So we talked about this incident, Bloody Sunday. I mentioned to you about the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Again, I told you that this lecture was going to be some review from last week, but I just wanted to make sure that I did my due diligence here. And in 1903 is when that Social Democratic Party of Russia, which, remember, political parties really didn't have a whole lot of influence because they're living in an autocratic, authoritarian state with the Tsar at the top of the political ladder making all the decisions. But the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks wanted to await the evolution of capitalism and the proletariat. They were seeking a more democratically oriented party with mass membership. The Bolsheviks, though, were going to be the radical communist sympathizers who followed Vladimir Lenin's ideas, which were based on Karl Marx's ideas. Not 100% the same, but very, very close. So the Marxists basically split into these two groups over revolutionary tactics. The Mensheviks being more moderate, wanting that popular support. The Bolsheviks being more radical, wanting to use violence, wanting to use revolution, wanting to and willing to sacrifice everything for change, even their own lives. So that's where we finally get to Vladimir Lenin. Who is Vladimir Lenin? Really, in many ways, he's the father and the architect of the communist revolution that happens in Russia in 1917. He was the leader of the Bolshevik Party. The Bolshevik Party, again, being the radical communist party. The Bolsheviks end up renaming themselves the Communist Party after they take power in Russia. Vladimir Lenin was a very organized leader of the party, and that is really one of the things that makes him unique from Marx, is that, remember that Marx said that the whole working class would kind of collectively rise up together and initiate a revolt, and political parties would be abolished. Lenin, on the other hand, by contrast to Marx, said that in order for a successful communist revolution to get off the ground, you needed the platform of an organized, disciplined leader of a political party to get people to act in an organized fashion and have a successful revolution, successful overthrow of the government. Vladimir Lenin, though, is also very, very ruthless. He's willing to create conditions in the revolution that would pit Russians against one another. And so for those people who oppose Vladimir Lenin's ideas, they become his enemy, his political enemy. And this creates the conditions for civil war in Russia. This is exactly what happens. Shortly after the Russian Revolution breaks out in 1917 and the Bolsheviks take control of the government, they immediately turn around and initiate a civil war against all other Russians, the Mensheviks and so on, who had been opposed to Vladimir Lenin's leadership. Now, remember, for a time, Vladimir Lenin is actually not even living in Russia. You might recall the story I told you last week about how his brother attempted to assassinate the Tsar. This resulted in Vladimir Lenin and the entire family of Vladimir Lenin being exiled from Russia. His brother, I believe, was executed. But he fled to Switzerland, which is in Western Europe, to avoid being arrested by the Tsarist regime. And so he was living in exile over in Switzerland for a number of years while World War I was going on and stuff like that, even beforehand. And he continued to maintain contact with the Bolsheviks in Russia and write political pamphlets and things like that in Switzerland. And so he is continuing his revolutionary work, even though he's living in exile several, hundred, more than 1,000 miles away in Switzerland. So, the workers were growing increasingly upset by the time that the early 1900s roll around. And you might wonder, why is it that communism, this is a good question to consider, why is it that communism is so appealing to the working class? You might notice this symbol. This is Vladimir Lenin here, okay, depicted in this piece of Russian propaganda. And in the background here, you may have seen this symbol before. This symbol, of course, is something that is frequently associated with not only the Soviet Union, but just communism in general. And the symbol is a sickle and a hammer. And, so why is it that communism appeals to the working class? Why is it that the symbol of communism are working class tools, things that you would find used by workers on farms or in factories? The reason is that of all the people in society, the working class are the ones that have it the hardest off, and the workers are not. You're 100% right. Okay, the rich getting richer and the workers don't like it. Couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly why communism appeals to the working class. And being that the working class also tends to be less educated, there is a tendency for the working class not to really have the intellectual means to understand that when promises are made to them by guys like Vladimir Lenin about creating an equal society and a society where the working class is no longer oppressed, the working class wants to believe it because they're the most desperate segment of society, or they're the segment of society that's most desperate for change. They want the most change because their lives are miserable. Why wouldn't they want their lives to change? They're hoping their lives are going to change for the better. And so it's easy, not easy, but it's easier to convince working class people that you're looking out for their best interest, when in fact, if we look throughout history at what happens to the working class when communism takes hold of a nation, typically the lives of the workers don't improve. All it does is it creates a state where everybody is equal, but they're equally poor. So as good as communism might sound on paper, in practice, it really creates a society that's quite downtrodden. Communist societies are renowned for, notorious for falling short of the promises that they make to the working class. They very rarely have ever created situations where let's be honest, they've never created a situation where people come out of it and they say, boy, I'm so happy that communist revolution happened because now everyone's equal and we're all just doing great. Okay, it doesn't happen that way. Communism always results in disappointment, taking people's freedom away from them, long-lasting promises that never get fulfilled, and more oppression. More oppression. Not less oppression, more oppression. But the working class, when their conditions are so miserable and all they want to do is hope against hope that their conditions will improve, it is easier to keep that group of people in a position of vulnerability and influence them to subscribe to your ideas, particularly when they become very desperate. It's easiest to convince people and get people on your side when their conditions are extremely desperate and they're very fearful and vulnerable. This is a teaching that goes all the way back to Niccolo Machiavelli, who we briefly talked about when we learned about the Renaissance way back in the very beginning of the school year, Unit 2. We learned about the Renaissance. Niccolo Machiavelli was an Italian diplomat who wrote a piece during the Renaissance on state affairs called The Prince. And The Prince was all about how rulers should be both cunning and ruthless. And Lenin very much utilizes some Machiavellianism in his rise to the top of the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, because he is a ruthless leader himself, who is absolutely willing to execute and use the secret police against anyone who disagrees with his political views. Lenin continued to build up his influence via the Bolshevik Party in Russia from afar until it was safe for him to return to Russia, which, interestingly enough, actually, it's during World War I that Vladimir Lenin finds his way back to Russia, and it's actually, believe it or not, it's because the Germans who were fighting against the Russians in World War I, the Germans know about Vladimir Lenin living in exile in Switzerland. Vladimir Lenin is like the Mentos to the Diet Coke of Russia, if you know what I'm talking about, okay? If Russia is a giant bottle of Diet Coke, dropping Vladimir Lenin in Russia is like dropping a Mentos into that Diet Coke, and he is going to cause that entire situation to absolutely explode over there, and the Germans know that. That's precisely why the Germans assist Vladimir Lenin in sneaking back into Russia in the latter part of World War I, is because Russia is already such a chaotic mess by that point. They know that dropping this revolutionary figure of Vladimir Lenin in there is going to cause the whole thing to just blow up. And that is exactly what happens. So, going back, talking a little bit about previously about the Bloody Sunday, the Revolution of 1905, as it's sometimes called. Liberalism had gradually grown in certain segments of the Russian population over the previous 50 years. There had been a developing, although limited, professional middle class that emerged due to increased educational opportunities, increased government jobs, increased industrial employment, and so on. But nonetheless, Russia's economy is still very poor, and the Russo-Japanese War, led the peasants, the rural workers, the farmers, the growing urban proletariat, factory workers, and the middle class, the limited bourgeoisie, to start demanding reforms, because remember, they're still living under an autocratic Tsar. Some of these reforms that they were pushing for included reduction of the working hours of the day and a factory insurance law, so that if somebody got injured on the job, they would be able to still receive health care or funding to be able to keep themselves alive. But the Russo-Japanese War led to Bloody Sunday, and in January of 1905, that was what we talked about last week with those 200,000 workers and their families who peacefully protested against the Tsar, wanting these job reforms. But then Nicholas II ordered soldiers from the Russian military to fire into this giant crowd, and it ended up killing several hundred people, wounding over 1,000 people, and this provoked riots across Russia because it was such a brutal display of oppression. These people are protesting because they're upset about the conditions, and instead of giving into the crowd, the Tsar decides to shoot into the crowd, killing and wounding many, many, many people. So already things are bad in Russia. Results of Bloody Sunday is that Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky are able to use this event to get more people on their side. And in light of the 1905 revolution, Bloody Sunday as it's nicknamed, the Bolsheviks that had been living in exile, like Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin, started planning a revolution. But it's going to take them about 12 years before they're able to get it off the ground. It's going to take a lot of planning, and they have to wait for the right time to initiate it. And so Lenin and Leon Trotsky formed those workers' Soviets, those councils of workers, soldiers, and intellectuals in Russia that I talked about. The influence of socialists, soldier Soviets, and other parties and soldiers started increasing before World War I. But when World War I breaks out in 1914, this causes more problems for Russia. The number of losses that Russia sustained in World War I was unlike anything any nation had ever seen in history. They were losing not just thousands, not just hundreds of thousands, millions and millions of people in the war. 4 million Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, died from disease, etc. during the first part of World War I. Russia performs so badly in World War I, they literally don't even make it to the end of the war. And the Tsar, during this time, loses complete confidence of both his people and the soldiers, the military itself. And so what we start to see happen by the time 1916, 1917 rolls around, 2-3 years into the war, is that we see mutinies take place. A mutiny, I don't know if you know anything about the military, but in the military there's 2 ranks of officers. You have what's known as your enlisted ranks. These are people, typically kids, young men, young women nowadays too, who sign up for the military at 18, 19 years old, and they join in the enlisted ranks. And you start out pretty much at the bottom of the ladder, and you build your way up. And you're usually doing some of the more manual labor, harder jobs and stuff like that. Go to boot camp and that sort of thing. Then there's also your officer ranks. Now, on their first day on the job, as a, let's say, 24-year-old, an officer will immediately outrank an enlisted officer, or a high-ranked enlisted rank person who's been working in the enlisted ranks for, let's say, 30 years. All officers outrank any enlisted person immediately because they're officers. It's a totally different tier of military ranks, and you have to be educated and go to officer candidate school and other things like that in order to become an officer in the military. But what happens in a mutiny is when your enlisted people, your lower ranks, stop listening to the orders of the officers, and then they overthrow the officers and start acting on their own. So the officers lose control of their ability to command the military. That's what a mutiny is. And this was happening across Russia about halfway through World War I. Meanwhile, bad weather, a backwards economy, and the fact that Russia was so behind in industrialization. Sure, they had industrialized some, but they weren't anywhere close to being able to supply their troops the way the British were, or the French were, or the Germans were. And so the troops on the front lines are struggling because they don't have enough boots, socks, guns, ammo, blankets, you name it. And then people are starving because Russia is so huge, and Russia is still, Russia really lags behind in terms of like infrastructure. So they don't have superhighways. They don't have freeways. Most of their roads in Russia are still dirt. They have some limited railroads, but again, not as effective as the Germans were. And so anyhow, the Russians are perpetually undersupplied. People are starving, And Russia had really started to withdraw from the war because the military just won't even listen to the officers in some cases. And this is where we finally get to the February Revolution. Now, when we talk about the Russian Revolution, one of the things that makes it a little complicated is that although 1917 is the magical year, it's kind of a buy one, get one deal, okay? If you ever go to Chipotle and you buy one burrito, you get one burrito free. I don't know if they do that anymore. But, the Russian Revolution is kind of like two revolutions for the price of one. All right, and this caused So hear me out. When we talk about the Russian Revolution, you're going to hear it happening in kind of two parts. There's the February Revolution, and then there's like the October Revolution. All right, so the initial revolution, all right, that happens in 1917 in Russia, is when the Tsar, Nicholas II, is forced to abdicate from the throne, step down from the throne. Abdicate is just a fancy word for step down from the throne. So what were the causes for the overthrow of Nicholas II? How does Nicholas II get forced to step down from his position as the Tsar of Russia? Most importantly, the number one reason was how badly Russia had performed in war, both the Russo-Japanese War as well as World War I. Already people had been suspicious of Nicholas II's ability to lead when Russia got destroyed by the Japanese as far back as 1905 in that first Russo-Japanese War we talked about. But then when World War I comes around 9 years later, that really put the nail in the coffin. People were extremely frustrated with what was considered to be a lack of leadership ability from the Tsar. A widespread discontent, too, as a result of the Tsar not willing to make these reforms. Remember, he made the Duma, that provisional government, and then promptly dissolved it like 2 or 3 times, and then eventually just completely stops listening to the Duma. And the Duma ends up not making any changes that are helpful to the working class population. And so, again, that would be another reason that the Tsar was overthrown, is because people were just tired of not being listened to. The Bloody Sunday attack is another way in which perfectly shows how resistant Tsar Nicholas II was to making changes that would help out the Russian people. But the most important cause by far is the tremendous amount of human loss and the economic toll it took on Russia during World War I. That was the most immediate cause of the Russian Revolution. And there was these massive military casualties, massive food shortages. The Tsar's leadership during the war was increasingly viewed as being utterly incompetent. Meanwhile, of course, while the Tsar was off fighting the war, the Tsar's widely hated wife, Tsarina Alexandra, and the entire Tsar's court was unduly influenced by the notorious Grigory Rasputin, who I told you about. And I said to you that Rasputin's a freaky-looking dude. You're going to be able to finally see a picture of him here coming up in just a second. The Tsarina and the Tsar both believed that Rasputin had mystically cured her son of hemophilia, that blood illness where your blood doesn't clot, and Russia's government ministers were increasingly frustrated by Rasputin's hold on the royal family and how much influence he had over them, because he was able to play their heartstrings. He was able to convince the royal family that he was the only one who could keep their child healthy and secure an heir to the Russian dynasty of the royal family. And so Russian nobles really hated Rasputin, because Rasputin shouldn't have been able to get between the nobles and the Tsar, but that's exactly what he was able to do. And they eventually conspire to assassinate him, and they are successful in doing so. And I told you that story towards the end of last week. Here's Rasputin, and you can see what I mean. He was extremely foreboding-looking guy, and this political cartoon on the right kind of shows you what I mean. He's got these dark circles under his eyes. He kind of looks like, a homeless murderer sort of a guy, kind of a freaky looking dude. But here he is, kind of cradling both the Tsar and the Tsarina, and you can see the kind of implication that this political cartoon on the right has about his political influence. And so Rasputin's seeming hold on the royal family seriously undermined the royal family's authority, because people thought that that the royal family wasn't making any decisions and that Rasputin was just making all their decisions for them. So the monarchy in 1915 starts to lose control. Nicholas II in 1915 fires his military commanders and moved his headquarters to the war front, hoping to be able to rally the troops together, take direct control over the military operations during World War I of the Russian troops. Meanwhile, his wife Alexandra was left in charge of the day-to-day operations, but really, probably very much Rasputin was the one who was pulling all of the strings and making most of the decisions at the upper levels of government, because Alexandra put all of her trust and power into Rasputin, who was this self-proclaimed holy man with these mystical abilities. And, that might seem like nonsense to you today, because, if somebody came and said, I have magical abilities, you should put me in a position of high authority, people, these days, because we know magic is a bunch of nonsense, would be like, what are you, nuts? There's no way, okay? But back in those days, mysticism, magic, particularly in a place like Russia, where intellectualism and the movement of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and stuff like that had not taken place, to the level that it had in Western Europe. So anyhow, 1916, a group of nobles murdered Rasputin in St. Petersburg, and neither Nicholas or Alexandra proved capable of tackling the enormous problems of food shortages, troop deaths, etc. And this results in more and more and more discontent. Yeah, he's a scary looking guy. There's no question about it. And so a general strike took place of workers. Peasant revolts, troop mutinies started to paralyze Russia by October. And October of 1916. And Nicholas was then forced to make concessions. One of the largest concessions that he was forced to make was the creation of that national parliament, the Duma, and serfs no longer had to make payments to the state for lands for lands received due to getting their freedom from serfdom. That's kind of a side point. You don't really need to know that side of things. Poles and Lithuanians were allowed to once again use their own languages. The religious toleration of Polish folks was allowed, who were largely Catholic or perhaps even Jewish. Political trials were returned to regular courts, and some of those restrictions on Jews were abolished during this time. But Nicholas was losing control. And so February/March Revolution, the reason that those names are interchangeable with one another, so let me just, to prevent confusion here, I mentioned to you a few moments ago that the Russian Revolution is kind of two revolutions for the price of one. And so Russia was on a different calendar, an older Eastern Orthodox calendar than the rest of Western Europe. And so one of the things that makes studying Russian history a little bit difficult is that the months are a little bit off. Because Russia doesn't convert to the standard calendar until later on. And so when we talk about early 1900s Russia, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the February Revolution. Other times you'll hear it referred to as the March Revolution. It's not because there were two of them. It just depends on which calendar historically you're referring to. Are you using the more modern calendar, or are you using the calendar that the Russians were using back in during the actual time? And so if you just understand that when we talk about the Russian Revolution, those terms February/March Revolution are interchangeable with one another. We're really talking about the same thing, okay? Strikes, revolts, protests led to Nicholas II having to step down from the throne. And here you can see Nicholas II being tossed in the garbage bin, and he is removed from his position as Tsar, and he would be the last person to hold the title of Tsar of Russia. So, the March Revolution, also sometimes called the February Revolution. Women who worked in factories in St. Petersburg, or as the Russians call it, Petrograd, stood in line after a 12-hour shift to purchase insanely high-priced bread. And so very similar, if you recall, when we learned about the French Revolution and the fearsome fish ladies who got angry at the price of bread in Paris, anytime bread reaches exorbitant costs, people get angry. Peasants in particular get angry, and often women peasants get angry because they're the ones that, from a gender role history, from a social gender history, were the ones who often would be the ones to purchase the bread in the local marketplaces and things like that. So the women are furious. And just like in the French Revolution, years and years and years prior, 10,000 women marched with the slogan, "Peace and Bread." And this was, in no small part, inspired by the Leninist revolutionaries, Vladimir Lenin himself, who adopted the slogan "Peace, Land, and Bread" for the Bolshevik Party during the year 1917 as the Russian Revolution is happening. And so in April of 1917, Vladimir Lenin released a political statement called the April Theses. And what the April Theses were a justification for political overthrow of the Russian government in the name of peace, land, and bread. And where did they get that from? Partly the women who marched during the March Revolution with the slogan "Peace and Bread." But what do we mean by peace, land, and bread? Well, peace, they first want Russia to get out of World War I. Peace, right? Bread. They're starving to death, and the bread prices are ridiculous. No one can afford it. So they want bread. Land. They want land because the Russian nobles, the Russian Eastern Orthodox Church, and so on, own all of the land. And it was very difficult if you were a peasant or an urban worker to ever have a plot of land that you could call your own. And so one of the ideas of communists was to take the land away from private companies, the government, etc., and then redistribute that land to the rest of the population. Okay, so peace, land, and bread. That's a very common theme, is that everybody would live and share the land with each other. That's always something that communist political theory promises to people, but always results in no one having any land and the government just taking control of all of the land. So the women end up being joined by other workers and create a general strike across Russia where the workers refuse to work. And the Tsar's solution was, once again, to fire upon the crowds, but instead of doing that this time, the soldiers refuse to fire on the crowds and end up instead joining the workers' movement. And which this is really unique, because this is when the Tsar has lost complete ability to do anything, because when he orders the Russian military to fire into the crowd of protesters this time, the military says, nope, we're going to join the protesters. Your time is done. And so Nicholas II has to step down from from Russia, and there were 3 centuries of Tsarist rule of the Romanov dynasty finally came to an end in 1917, and a year later, all of his family was executed by communist Bolshevik revolutionaries under the orders of Vladimir Lenin. Why did they execute his whole family after he had already stepped down from power? This was to ensure that no relative, child, grandchild, great-grandchild would ever come out of the woodwork and try and reclaim the leadership of Russia by saying, oh, well, I am actually the grandson and rightful heir to the throne of the Romanov dynasty. They executed his entire family to absolutely ensure that no one would be able to make a claim later on about being a rightful ruler and challenge the new Bolshevik government that had just taken over. So that's why they do that. The March Revolution succeeded in bringing down the Tsar. However, when this is why the Russian Revolution is two for the price of one. When the Tsar steps down from power, believe it or not, actually, it's not quite Vladimir Lenin that comes to power yet. Okay, Vladimir Lenin does not come to a position as the true leader of Russia until the very, very tail end of 1917. Okay. Hey, folks, just listen up to this. I know you guys are having some side chats there, but just listen up to this last little part here. I'm almost done for the day. By the way, I did not put that vocab assignment up over the weekend, but rest assured it will be up this time. So do not forget to go on today. I didn't want to post it on Saturday, figuring some people may have just given up on it or whatever. So I waited until today, but I will for sure be posting the vocab assignment today. So please don't forget to do that. That will be due on Friday morning, just as a little bit of a side note to you. Okay, but to finish this up real quickly, I just want to finish with talking a little bit about where we're going to be going next in terms of the lecture when we come back on Friday. And that is that when the Tsar steps down, that's in March of 1917, early in the year, okay? At the end of the year, towards October, November, there is actually a second revolution, because during the time between March and October, okay, during the time between March and October, Vladimir Lenin had not yet taken over the government. The government that was in power for that 6 to 8 month period, however long that is, was actually the Duma. The Duma had been, remember, that kind of toothless organization that was unable to really convince the Tsar to make any real changes. The Duma is what is left of the government when the Tsar steps down. So the Duma was led by a guy by the name of Alexander Kerensky, and Alexander Kerensky and the delegates, the representatives who served in the Duma, proved unable to handle changes as quickly as many Russians had hoped to see them. Remember what I told you before about when you try and make changes to the economy. The economy is kind of like a giant ocean barge that you see out at Long Beach or something like that. Once they're moving in a certain direction, it's really difficult to slow a barge down, change its direction, change its course, turn it around. The economy, you can make laws, but the economy can sometimes take years before laws will have an effect on changing the economy. But the Russians were already so fed up by the time that the Tsar steps down that it kind of set the Duma up to fail, because nothing that the Duma was going to be able to do would initiate change fast enough in Russia where people would be happy. And so 6, 7, 8 months go by. People are getting increasingly frustrated. The Tsar stepped down. How come I'm still starving? How come we're still losing the war? How come this? How come that? Okay? And eventually, the Duma loses the ability to maintain control. And that's when, at the end of the year, October, November, there is a second revolution of 1917 that sees the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, be able to come to power. They storm the building that the Duma met in, the Winter Palace, and it's a peaceful insurrection. When they storm the Winter Palace, it's a bloodless coup. There's no one that's killed in that particular event. However, afterwards, after the Bolsheviks take over the government, immediately a civil war breaks out in Russia, and Vladimir Lenin starts using the secret police and various other dubious methods to kill any political opponents, to make it easier for him to completely take over the government. And so that's kind of the direction that we are going in. And so, as I said, people needed someone to rule. That provisional Duma temporary government, provisional simply means temporary, was established, led by Alexander Kerensky. But again, okay, they continued fighting World War I. They continued losing World War I. And that's really what ultimately led to the Duma losing support very quickly, is how badly Russia continued to perform throughout the summer of 1917, and eventually angry peasants end up making more and more and more demands, and the Bolshevik Party leads this coup against the Duma, the provisional government. So that is where I will leave off the lecture today. I want to thank you guys for tuning in this morning. As you can see, I came into the high school today to do my lecture and check things out. I haven't been in a little while, get some other work done. I've got to get some stuff done for my college classes, which start next week. And so we decided to come in here today. But I want you guys to have a wonderful rest of the day. I will post the vocab assignment in hopefully just a few minutes here, and you'll be able to get started on that. And that will be due on Friday. That will be the only assignment that you have for this week. Other than that, have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll see you back on Friday morning. Make good decisions.